Una Park stood in the massive docking bay of Station Vareth 7 with her small travel bag hanging from her shoulder and her heart beating fast inside her chest. She had traveled for 3 weeks through the cold darkness of space to reach this place, and now she was finally here at the Galactic Integration Academy, where species from across the galaxy came to learn how to live together in peace. The station was enormous and filled with aliens of every shape and size imaginable. Some had scales, and others had fur, and some had skin that shifted colors like living rainbows. Una tried not to stare, but it was difficult, because she had never seen anything like this in her 19 years of life on Earth. She approached the registration desk, where a floating holographic sphere served as the administrative assistant. The AI scanned her documents with a beam of blue light and made a soft humming sound. Una Park from Earth in the Sol System. I announced in a flat mechanical voice. You are assigned to room 7C in the training wing. Please proceed through corridor Alpha and take the 3rd elevator to level 7. Una bowed politely out of habit and thanked the AI, even though she was not sure if artificial beings appreciated such gestures. She followed the directions carefully and walked through corridors filled with strange smells and stranger sounds. Aliens passed her on both sides, and most of them towered over her small frame. She was only 160 centimeters tall and weighed barely 50 kilograms, which made her feel like a child among giants. The elevator carried her up to level 7, and she stepped out into a wide hallway with metal walls and bright lights. She found room 7C at the end of the corridor and paused outside the door to take a deep breath. This was her chance to prove that humans belonged among the stars, and she would not waste it. The door slid open with a hiss, and Una walked inside. She froze immediately. The training hall was massive, with high ceilings and padded floors designed for combat. But that was not what made her stop breathing. It was the creatures inside the room that made her blood run cold. There were 8 aliens in the hall, and every single one of them looked like a nightmare given flesh. 3 of them were Vrikari, and they stood over 2 meters tall, with dark green scales and yellow eyes that had vertical pupils like snakes. Their mouths were filled with teeth that curved backward, and their claws looked sharp enough to cut through steel. 4 others were Korath, and they were even more terrifying, with 4 muscular arms each and bodies built like tanks. Their skin was gray and thick like armor, and their faces had no expression that Una could read. The last one was a Thessan with silver fur and a body shaped like a wolf that had learned to walk on 2 legs. Its ears were pointed, and its eyes glowed amber in the bright lights of the training hall. Every single one of them turned to look at Una when she entered. She wanted to run, but her legs would not move. A deep voice cut through the silence like a blade. You must be the human. Una turned to see another Vrikari emerging from a side room. This one was older than the others, with scars covering half of his face and one eye that had turned white from some old injury. He wore a uniform that marked him as an instructor, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had killed many times and would not hesitate to kill again. I am Instructor Vorn, he said while looking down at Una like she was an insect. This is the Predator Combat Integration course. You are on my roster, so I assume the administration knows what they are doing, even if I have my doubts. Una opened her mouth to explain that there must be some mistake, but the words died in her throat. The roster said she belonged here, so perhaps she did. Humans were new to the galactic community, and maybe the administrators knew something about her species that she did not. Find a place to stand and do not get in the way, Vorn ordered before turning to address the entire class. Today we begin with dominance assessments. Each of you will face an opponent, and we will establish the hierarchy of this unit. The strong will lead, and the weak will follow. This is the natural order. The predators in the room shifted with excitement, and Una could feel their hunger like heat from a fire. These were creatures born to hunt and fight and kill. They live for moments like this. "We will start with the newcomer," Vorn announced, and a chill ran down Yuna's spine. Drex stepped forward and assessed the human. One of the Korath moved into the center of the room, and Yuna realized with horror that he was the smallest of his kind present. He was still twice her size, with 4 arms that could crush her like paper, and eyes that showed no mercy at all. "This will be quick," Drex said, and the other predators laughed. Yuna walked slowly to the center of the room and faced the massive alien. Her heart was pounding so hard that she could hear it in her ears, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had trained in self-defense back on Earth, and she had worked as a paramedic in one of the most dangerous cities in Korea. She knew how to stay calm when everything around her was chaos. She bowed to Drex out of respect and then asked in a quiet voice, "Should I begin?" The laughter from the other predators grew louder, and Drex cracked his 4 sets of knuckles with sounds like breaking wood. Instructor Vorn watched with cold interest and waited to see how quickly the human would fall. None of them knew what was about to happen. None of them understood what humans really were. And none of them were ready for the small girl from Earth who refused to be afraid. Drex moved first, because predators always move first, and that was the way of the universe as far as he knew. His upper right arm shot forward in a strike that had broken bones in dozens of species across the galaxy. The blow was fast and powerful and aimed directly at the tiny human's head. But the human was not there anymore. Yuna had stepped to the side at the last possible moment and let the massive fist pass through empty air. She did not strike back, and she did not run away. She simply moved to a new position and waited. Drex turned with a growl and attacked again, with all 4 arms swinging in a pattern designed to trap and crush. Yuna ducked under the first swing and sidestepped the second and leaned away from the third and stepped through the gap left by the fourth. She moved like water flowing around stones, and she never stopped moving. "Stand still and fight," Drex roared with frustration building in his voice. But Yuna did not stand still, because standing still against a stronger opponent was suicide. She had learned this lesson years ago when she was a young girl training in the mountains of Korea with her grandfather. He had taught her that true strength was not about hitting hard, but about lasting long. He had taught her that patience was the greatest weapon of all. Drex attacked again and again, and each time Yuna was somewhere else when his strikes arrived. She watched his movements and learned his patterns and waited for him to make mistakes. She did not need to hurt him, because he was hurting himself with every wasted attack. The other predators had stopped laughing. Instructor Vorn leaned forward with his one good eye fixed on the impossible scene in front of him. The human was not fighting, but she was not losing either. She was doing something he had never seen before in 40 years of training the deadliest species in the galaxy. She was enduring. 3 minutes passed, and then 4, and then 5, and Drex was breathing hard with sweat dripping from his gray skin. His attacks were slower now and less precise, and his 4 arms felt like they were filled with lead. The human should have been dead, or at least bleeding, but she did not have a single mark on her body. Drex overextended on his next strike, and Yuna saw her opportunity. She did not hit him because hitting him would only make him angry. Instead, she grabbed his wrist and stepped into his body and used his own momentum against him. He flew over her hip and crashed into the padded floor with a sound like thunder. The room went completely silent. Drex lay on his back and stared at the ceiling while trying to understand what had just happened. The human had not beaten him with strength or speed or ferocity. She had beaten him with patience and timing and perfect control. She had beaten him by refusing to fight on his terms. He stood up with rage burning in his eyes and attacked again with desperate fury. The same thing happened. He ended up on the floor. He rose and attacked once more. The floor welcomed him again. This pattern repeated 3 more times until Drex was gasping for breath and trembling with exhaustion. Una stood nearby with her hands at her sides and her breathing only slightly faster than when they had started. She was not tired because she had not been fighting. She had been waiting and moving and letting her opponent destroy himself. Instructor Vaughn's scales shifted from dark green to pale yellow, and this was a sign of deep shock among the Vreckeri. He had trained predators from 100 different worlds, and he had never seen anything like this before. The human was using a hunting technique that his people had only heard about in legends. Persistence predation. Humans did not chase their prey to catch it immediately. They chased it until it collapsed from exhaustion. They followed it for hours or even days until it could not run anymore. They did not need to be the fastest or the strongest because they were the most enduring creatures in the known galaxy. "Enough," Vaughn called out, and his voice cracked slightly. "The assessment is complete." Drex stumbled back to his place among the other Korath, and none of them would meet his eyes. He had been humiliated by a creature half his size, and he did not even understand how it had happened. The Thessan pack leader was a female named Keth with silver fur and sharp amber eyes. She leaned toward her packmates and whispered in a voice that carried across the silent room, "She is not prey. She is something else entirely." Instructor Vaughn walked slowly toward Una and looked down at her with an expression she could not read. His scales were still pale, and his scarred face was tight with something that might have been fear or might have been respect. "Human," he said in a voice that demanded truth. "What were you before you came to this academy?" Una looked up at the massive predator and answered simply without any pride or boasting in her tone. "I was a paramedic. I saved lives." The silence that followed was so complete that Una could hear the ventilation system humming in the walls. Every predator in the room was staring at her with new eyes, and she could see something changing in the way they held themselves. She was not what they had expected. She was not what anyone had expected. And somewhere in the administrative systems of Station, Vareth 7, a paperwork error remained undiscovered while the small human girl from Earth began to change everything that the Predator Combat Integration course thought it knew about. Strength and weakness and the true meaning of survival. Word spread through the Galactic Integration Academy, like fire spreading through dry grass, and by the next morning, everyone knew about the human in Predator class. The story grew larger with each telling, until some versions claimed that Una had defeated 10 opponents at once, while other versions said she had killed a Vreckeri with her bare hands. The truth was strange enough without the exaggerations. Una walked through the corridors of the station and felt eyes following her everywhere she went. The prey species watched her with terror because they could not understand why a human was training with predators. The predators watched her with curiosity because they could not understand how she had survived the assessment. Everyone watched because humans were still new and mysterious, and this one had done something impossible. Instructor Vaughn spent that night in his quarters, reading everything he could find about Earth and humanity. The files were extensive because the Galactic Council had studied humans carefully before allowing them to join the interstellar community. What he read made his scales shift through every color of shock and disbelief. Earth was a death world. The gravity was crushing, and the atmosphere was corrosive, and the planet was covered with apex predators that made Vreckeri look like harmless pets. Humans had evolved in this nightmare, and they had not just survived but thrived. They had hunted creatures larger than themselves by chasing them until their hearts gave out. They had developed a chemical called adrenaline that allowed them to perform impossible feats when protecting their young or their packmates. They could survive injuries that would kill any other species, and they could adapt to environments that would destroy entire civilizations. And this particular human had spent years running into burning buildings and disaster zones to save strangers. Vaughn closed the files and sat in the darkness of his room and wondered what he had invited into his class. The next day at the midday meal, Una sat alone in the massive cafeteria. because no one wanted to sit near the strange human who belonged nowhere. She ate the bland nutrition paste that was the only food safe for her biology, and she did not complain because complaining would not change anything. 3 shadows fell across her table, and she looked up to see Keth the Thessan standing with 2 of her packmates behind her. Their silver fur was bristled, and their amber eyes were intense, and Una could not tell if they wanted to talk or attack. "May I sit?" Keth asked in a voice that sounded like gravel scraping against stone. Una nodded and gestured to the empty seat across from her. Keth sat down while her packmates remained standing behind her like guards. The cafeteria grew quiet as every species in the room watched the confrontation. "You did not hurt Drex," Keth said, without any greeting or introduction. "You could have broken his arm when you threw him, but you redirected your force to protect his joints. You could have struck his throat when he was on the ground, but you stepped back and waited. Why did you show mercy to an enemy?" Una thought about the question for a moment before answering. "Drex was not my enemy. He was just scared and trying to prove himself. Hurting scared people does not fix anything. It just makes more scared people." Keth's ears flattened against her skull, and her packmates exchanged confused glances. This answer made no sense to creatures who had been raised to believe that dominance came from pain and submission came from fear. "In my culture," Keth said slowly, "mercy is weakness. The strong take what they want, and the weak give what they must. This is the natural order of all things." "In my culture," Una replied with a small smile, "the strong protect the weak, the powerful serve the powerless. This is what makes us human." Keth stared at Una for a long time, and something shifted in her amber eyes. It was not understanding, because understanding would take much longer to develop. But it was the beginning of doubt, and doubt was the first crack in any wall. "You are strange," Keth finally said. "I will watch you unlearn what you are." She rose and walked away with her pack, following close behind, and Una returned to her meal as if nothing important had happened. That night, Una sat in her small quarters and used the station's communication system to call her mother on Earth. The connection was poor, and the image was grainy, but she could see her mother's kind face, and that was enough. "Ama," Una said in Korean, because some things could only be said in her first language. "I am scared." Her mother's face filled with concern and love. "What happened, my daughter? Are you hurt?" "No," Una said while shaking her head. "I am not hurt. But I am in a place where I do not belong. They put me in a class for predators, and everyone here thinks that strength means hurting others. They think mercy is weakness and compassion is foolishness. I do not know if I can change their minds." Her mother was quiet for a moment, and then she smiled the same smile that had comforted Una through every difficult moment of her life. "You cannot change their minds, my daughter. You can only show them another way. Be who you are, and let them decide for themselves what kind of strength they want to have." Una wiped tears from her eyes and nodded. "I will try, Alma. I will try." They talked for a few more minutes about home and family, and the cherry blossoms that would bloom soon in the mountains. Then the connection ended, and Una was alone again in her small room on a station full of predators who did not understand her. She did not know that Instructor Vorn was standing outside her door. She did not know that he had heard every word of her conversation. She did not know that in 40 years of teaching predators to kill and conquer, he had never once heard a student talk about showing another way. He walked away into the darkness of the station, and his scales shifted to colors that no one else could see. Something was changing inside him, something he did not have a name for yet. 3 weeks passed, and Una survived every test and exercise that Instructor Vorn put before the class. She was never the fastest or strongest, but she was always the last one standing when everyone else had given up. The other predators began to watch her differently, and some of them even started to copy the way she moved and waited and endured. Drex had stopped looking at her with hatred, and now his eyes held something that might have been respect. Kath and her pack had started sitting near Yuna during meals and asking her questions about Earth and humanity and the strange philosophy that valued mercy over dominance. The changes were small, but they were real. Then came the crisis simulation. Instructor Vorn gathered the class in a special holographic training room that could create any scenario with perfect detail. The walls flickered and transformed into a burning space station, filled with smoke and debris and the screams of simulated victims. "This is your final test before practical deployment," Vorn announced to the assembled predators. "A hostile force has taken control of Station Meridian, and they are holding civilian hostages. Your mission is to neutralize the enemy with maximum efficiency. Civilian casualties are acceptable losses as long as the mission is completed." Yuna felt her stomach turn cold at those words. Acceptable losses, as if living beings were just numbers on a report. "You will work in teams of 3, Vorn continued. "The team with the fastest completion time and highest enemy neutralization rate will receive commendations. Begin when ready." The first team was made up of 3 Vrakari, and they charged into the simulation with claws extended and teeth bared. Yuna watched on the external monitors as they tore through the holographic environment with brutal efficiency. They did not slow down for civilians, and they did not check their targets. They simply killed everything in their path until the mission was complete. 4 minutes and 37 seconds. 12 enemies neutralized, 8 civilians killed. Instructor Vorn nodded with approval and made notes on his datapad. The second team was Korath, and they were even faster, with even more civilian casualties. The third team was mixed species, and they fell somewhere in the middle. Each team treated the civilians as obstacles at best and targets at worst. Then it was Yuna's turn. She was assigned to work alone because no one wanted to partner with the strange human who refused to fight properly. The simulation reset, and she walked into the burning station with nothing but her training and her principles. She moved slowly through the corridors and kept her back to the walls and her eyes on every shadow. The holographic enemies were programmed to behave like real hostiles, and they hid among the civilians and used them as shields. A predator would simply kill through the shields, but Yuna was not a predator. She found the first group of hostages huddled in a storage room with 2 enemies guarding them. The enemies raised their weapons, but Yuna was already moving. She slipped through the door at an angle that put a support pillar between herself and their line of fire. She closed the distance in 3 quick steps and grabbed the first enemy's weapon arm and twisted it into a lock that sent him crashing to the floor unconscious. The second enemy tried to grab a civilian, but Yuna was faster. She put herself between the gun and the hostage and took the simulated shot in her shoulder. The impact hurt like fire, but she did not stop. She drove her palm into the enemy's chin, and he dropped like a stone. The civilians stared at her with wide eyes, and she told them to stay hidden until rescue arrived. She continued through the station and repeated this process again and again. She absorbed shots meant for civilians, and she disabled enemies without killing them when possible. She used her body as a shield because that was what her body was for. 80 minutes and 42 seconds. 14 enemies neutralized, 0 civilian casualties. Yuna walked out of the simulation with simulated blood covering her uniform and simulated wounds marking her body. According to the computer, she had died 3 times during the exercise. 3 times she had taken fatal damage to protect someone else. The training room was completely silent. Instructor Vorn stared at the results on his datapad, and his claws tightened until the device creaked in protest. He opened his mouth to reprimand her for her inefficiency and her disregard for her own survival and her complete failure to follow the established protocols. The words would not come. He stood there with his mouth open and his one good eye fixed on the small human who was somehow still standing despite everything. She looked back at him without fear or defiance, and when she spoke her voice was calm and clear. "The mission was to save people," Yuna said. I saved them. Vorn closed his mouth and looked at the datapad again. 0 civilian casualties. No team in the history of his class had ever achieved that result. No team had ever prioritized the lives of strangers over the success of the mission. No team had ever chosen to die for people they did not know. The other students began to whisper among themselves, and Vorn could hear confusion and wonder, and something that sounded almost like shame in their voices. They had killed without thinking, and she had died without hesitation, and both of them had completed the mission, but only one of them had completed it right. After the class was dismissed, Drex approached Yuna in the corridor outside the training room. His forearms were crossed over his chest, but his posture was not threatening. He looked uncertain and young despite his massive size. "Human," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. "Yuna, will you teach me?" Yuna tilted her head with curiosity. "Teach you what?" Drex struggled to find the words, and his gray skin flushed with embarrassment. "Teach me how to protect instead of destroy. Teach me how to be strong in the way that you are strong." Yuna looked up at the Korath, who had tried to break her on her first day, and she saw something new in his eyes. She saw the first spark of a different kind of strength. She smiled and nodded. "I will try." And somewhere in the shadows of the corridor, Instructor Vorn watched them walk away together. His scales shifted through colors that meant hope. The emergency alarm tore through station. Vareth 7, with a sound like screaming metal and red lights, flooded every corridor. Yuna was in the middle of teaching Drex a joint lock when the announcement came through the speakers and froze everyone in place. A transport ship called the Gentle Horizon had crashed on a moon 3 hours away, and there were over 200 survivors trapped in the wreckage. The ship had been carrying a mixed population of predator and prey species, traveling together to a new colony world. Medical teams were being assembled, but they needed personnel who could handle both types of passengers. Instructor Vorn gathered his senior students in the briefing room and looked at them with his one good eye burning with intensity. This was real, and there would be no second chances, and lives would be lost if they failed. "The rescue teams need support," Vorn said. "The Predator Combat Integration Course has never participated in civilian rescue operations, but I am making an exception. I need volunteers who can work with mixed species without causing additional trauma." Every predator in the room looked at Yuna. She stepped forward without hesitation and said, "I volunteer." Drex stepped forward next, and his forearms were steady despite the fear in his eyes. "I volunteer." Kath and 2 of her packmates joined them, and soon Vorn had a team of 6, including the small human, who had changed everything. He looked at them and felt something he had not felt in 40 years of training killers. He felt proud. The transport ship carried them through the darkness of space toward the wounded moon, and Yuna used the time to brief her unlikely squad. She taught them how to approach frightened prey species and how to make themselves appear smaller and less threatening. She taught them the words to say and the words to avoid, and the importance of asking permission before touching. "Remember," she said as the moon grew larger in the viewport, "these people are hurt and scared. They have probably never been this close to predator species before. We are not here to save them from danger. We are here to show them that not all danger needs to be feared." The crash site was chaos wrapped in tragedy. The Gentle Horizon had broken into 3 pieces when it hit the surface, and debris was scattered across kilometers of barren rock. Emergency shelters had been set up by the first responders, but the situation inside was failing fast. The prey species were huddled in one section and refused to let anyone near them because the only rescuers available were predators from other ships. They would rather die than accept help from creatures that looked like the monsters from their nightmares. Yuna walked toward the largest shelter and ignored the warnings from the other rescue teams. A massive Rakari medic grabbed her arm and growled that the prey species had already attacked 2 rescuers who tried to approach. They were beyond reason, and there was nothing anyone could do. Let me try, Yuna said, and the Vakari released her with a skeptical snort. She entered the shelter alone and found approximately 80 prey species crammed into a space meant for 30. They were Feli and Morasi and Thren, and a dozen other species that had evolved to run and hide from creatures, like the ones waiting outside. When they saw Yuna, their screaming intensified, and several of them tried to flee deeper into the shelter. Yuna stopped walking and lowered herself to her knees. She placed her hands on the ground in front of her, with her palms facing upward. She waited. A Feli mother clutching her injured child was closest to Yuna, and her enormous eyes were wild with terror. She was small and covered in soft blue fur, and she looked at the human like Yuna was death itself come to collect her. "I am not going to hurt you," Yuna said in a soft voice. "I know you are scared. I know you think I am a predator. But I am here to help, and I will not touch you unless you ask me to." The Feli mother trembled and held her child tighter. "My name is Yuna," she continued. "I am from a planet called Earth. I was a paramedic there, which means I help people who were hurt and scared just like you. I have been doing this my whole life, and I promise you that I will not let anything bad happen to you or your child." She remained perfectly still with her hands open and her eyes soft. 1 minute passed, and then 2, and the Feli mother's trembling began to slow. "Your child is hurt," Yuna said gently. "I can see the wound on her arm from here. If you do not let someone treat it soon, she might lose the limb. Please let me help. Please trust me." The Feli mother looked at her child, and then at Yuna, and something broke behind her enormous eyes. She took one shaky step forward and then another, and then she was standing in front of the human with tears streaming down her blue fur. "Please," she whispered. "Please save my daughter." Yuna treated the child's wound with steady hands and soft words, and the other prey species watched in stunned silence. Then another Feli approached with an injured mate, and Yuna helped them too. Then a Morasi with a broken limb and a Thran with internal bleeding, and one by one, the prey species came to the human who had knelt in the dirt and waited for them to trust her. Yuna called for her team, and Drex entered the shelter slowly with his massive body hunched to appear smaller. Keth and her pack followed with their ears flat and their movements careful. They approached the prey species the way Yuna had taught them, and they asked permission, and they waited for trust. The other rescue teams watched in disbelief as predators carried prey, and prey accepted help from predators. The barriers that had separated these species for millions of years melted away in the face of compassion and patience and the simple choice to be gentle. Every survivor was saved. When the transport ships lifted off from the moon and carried the rescued toward proper medical facilities, the crews reported something unprecedented. Predators and prey were sitting together without fear. They were talking and sharing food and even laughing despite the tragedy they had endured. One small human had shown them another way. Back at Station Vareth 7, Instructor Vorn submitted his official report on the rescue operation. His claws hesitated over the keyboard when he reached the section for notable personnel, and he stared at the blinking cursor for a long time before he began to type. Human female Yuna Park demonstrated exceptional performance during the Gentle Horizon rescue operation. She was instrumental in establishing trust with traumatized prey species, and her leadership enabled successful integration of predator rescue personnel with prey casualties. Traditional classification systems are inadequate to describe her capabilities. Recommended designation: Bridge species. She does not hunt, and she does not flee. She connects. He submitted the report and then opened another file. It was Yuna's original assignment paperwork, and it clearly showed that she was supposed to be in the Prey Species Adaptation course. The administrative AI had made an error in room assignment, and no one had caught it. Vorn stared at the file and then deleted it. The error did not matter anymore. 2 days later, the Academy administration discovered the paperwork mistake and called Yuna to their offices. They apologized profusely and offered her immediate transfer to her correct course. where she would learn alongside other prey species in a safe and comfortable environment. Yuna thanked them politely and declined. "My students need me," she said with a smile. "And I think I need them too." She returned to the Predator Combat Integration course, where Drex and Keth and the others were waiting for her. They were different now, with softer eyes and gentler movements, and they looked at her with something that went beyond respect. They looked at her with hope. Across the galaxy, word spread about the human who had tamed predators with patience and taught hunters to heal. They called her many things in many languages, but one name rose above all others: the Miracle Girl. Not because she performed miracles, but because she made others believe that miracles were possible. And in a universe that had known only competition and fear and the endless cycle of predator and prey, she had offered something new. She had offered connection. She had offered peace. She had offered the simple revolutionary idea that strength could mean something other than the power to destroy. And slowly but surely the galaxy began to listen.